And welcome back to Bossing Revenge Tragedy with Mr. F. Today we will be taking a meander through the last stages of Shakespeare's revenge tragedy Hamlet, and kind of wandering through it, thinking about why it's tragic, and is Hamlet a tragic hero, and how did we end up with all those corpses on the stage in the climax of the play, or to use some classical terminology, the catastrophe, the end point of our play. We have Gertrude, Laertes, Claudius and Hamlet lying dead or dying, and obviously we've also had Ophelia dying off stage previously, Polonius, as well as old Hamlet before the play starts. So there's a lot of bodies. The thing to remember is, where is revenge tragedy coming from? It comes from Seneca, the Roman classicist and author, playwright, who wrote a number of tragedies, including Oedipus, Phaedra, Agamemnon, and was really a huge influence on Shakespeare for his revenge tragedies. Senecan tragedy evident in Hamlet through the theme of revenge, the corpse-strewn climax, and dramaturgical use of a ghost, all follow the Senecan model of revenge tragedy. This isn't Shakespeare's first revenge tragedy. Revenge tragedy, as influenced by Seneca's Roman tragedies, starts with Thomas Kyd and the Spanish tragedy in 1587, and Shakespeare's first and much more bloody revenge tragedy is Titus Andronicus, 1589 to 92, whereas obviously Hamlet later, 1599 to 1601, which might indicate why, after having done Titus Andronicus, which is really very bloody, I think we have up to 16 or 14 killings in that one, a lot of them happening on stage. 14 dead bodies, and a lot of those, 9 of those happen on stage. So it's a lot bloodier, and some of the topics are a lot more outre: insanity, cannibalism, rape, 6 severed members. So we can see why, revisiting the genre of revenge tragedy, Hamlet is a completely different kettle of fish, although tropes, generic tropes of the classic Senecan revenge tragedy are still there, including that body count at the end. What I'm really interested in this video is the tragedy part of revenge tragedy, as well as the revenge part of revenge tragedy. So by the end we're going to think about how is revenge enacted, and is there any sense of justice for the people seeking revenge, because of course it's not just Hamlet seeking revenge. At the end we have Laertes seeking revenge, and maybe we could think of Claudius, although he's not doing it for any reason of having suffered a loss, unlike Laertes, whose father and sister have died, therefore wants to kill Hamlet. Maybe Claudius is seeking revenge in a more modern way, feeling injustice or antagonistic towards Hamlet or the Danish state. I don't know. You could maybe explore that if you wanted to. It's a bit more out there, isn't it? Okay, so we're going to look at this by looking at Fortinbras. Let me just scribble on here Seneca and Seneca, because you know, go on to, I would always recommend Wikipedia, right? Because the other one is the Encyclopedia Britannica. Go and have a look at what they have to say about revenge tragedies. Go and look at the Hamlet page on Wikipedia. It's very, very good. And these are, I think, by now, very reliable sources of knowledge. So there would be pro tips from me. We're going to look at this through some of the final words of the play, which come from the ultimate victor of this revenge tragedy, is the alien, the outsider, who comes in and wins all by default because there's no one left of the Danish court to take over. Fortinbras, who says of Hamlet, Let four captains bear Hamlet like a soldier to the stage, for he was likely, had he been put on, had he been crowned king, to have proved most royally. So this is a really useful phrase. Bear Hamlet like a soldier to the stage. That shows the respect and honour being accorded to him, so his reputation's been salvaged by the end, thanks in part to Horatio not committing suicide following Hamlet's orders, his dying wish for him to stay alive and tell the tale of what passed, and therefore rescue his what's the word I'm looking for? Rescue his posthumous reputation. Beautiful. For he was likely, had he been put on, to have proved most royal. This one, it's most royal in my Cambridge Schools edition. This from the internet is not, so I would stick to he was likely, had he been put on, to have proved most royal, not most royally. So we'll use that one here, scribble that out. Which suggests he was going to become a good king, and we've seen him being a very mixed, emotional, kind of divided, melancholic prince, and I think a lot of that's to do with his scholasticity, his fact of being a scholar, of being a rational Renaissance man who applies thought to problems, and maybe in the modern parlance we would say overthinks. So this excess of rationality, this cogitation, this propensity to ponder, reflect, maybe leads him astray, or appears to, or we could see that in a positive light, that rather than taking action, he tries to take the best action and apply judgment and reason to it. The fact is, between Act 1 and Act 5, something's changed about him, and he would have proved most royally, and Fortinbras gleans this from the tale that Horatio tells about what's happened. So that's quite interesting, and he accords him a burial with the right honours for someone who would have proved most royal. Do we see then, so there's the tragedy, isn't there? Someone who would have proved most royal but doesn't get the chance to do so because they're dead. There's our tragedy. We would have finally had a great king who would have rectified the rotten state of Denmark, the unweeded garden, and and put the time out of joint back in joint, if that makes sense. He would have reset the time so it was more amenable for people in Elsinore. But he doesn't get to do that. There's our tragedy, the fate unfulfilled. But do we see that change, that tragic hero? Do we see Hamlet proving most royal in the final moments of the play? And if so, where? And we're going to look at some examples where I think he does. Some of the interesting passages are the ones that talk about divine providence, and Hamlet several times refers to divine providence as if what will be. If he's meant to die now, he will die now. And this in a way seems to free him up to act. So we've had a lot of indecision or moments of apparent indecision, inaction on the part of Hamlet, weighing up the pros and cons rather than acting decisively in the way that we saw Laertes do when he sought revenge immediately following Ophelia's death and what happened to his father. So Hamlet himself then seems to mature in his thinking, and the kind of realization that there's a divine providence, a divine plan, seems to free him up to act, hence his willingness to fight Laertes, because, well, if he dies, it's meant to be, and there's nothing he could have done otherwise. There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. It's interesting that sometimes he uses the we here, and it might be because he's talking to Horatio, another scholar, a kind of intellectual equal, but it might be this use of the we at several moments here. Maybe he's already speaking like the future king he never gets to be with the royal we. There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. So whatever we do, however we mere mortals try to arrange things ourselves. There are things beyond our control that ultimately decide what happens to us. When he decides to go through and kill Claudius, is it not perfect conscience to quit him with this arm? We talked in the previous video about this use of the word conscience. And is it not to be damned to let this canker of our nature come into further evil? Canker here is like a cancer or tumour, and there's that illness theme returning here. So it's the idea that he's obliged to act. Perfect conscience, the interesting adjective phrase there, or noun phrase, to quit him with this arm. And it has to be this arm, you know, it has to be the son of the murdered father's arm that gets the revenge. And if he were not to do so, it would be something that deserved damnation, because it's a way to rectify the rottenness, the corrupting, malign. You know, we can think of a cancer, a tumour, as something malign, evil, and that's where we get that evil there. Maybe it needs to be excised, cut out of. Not sure what that's doing there. Get rid of that. He has confidence in his skills. You will lose this wager, my lord. I do not think so. So we see a much more decisive Hamlet here. Since he went into France, I have been in continual practice. I shall win at the odds. But thou wouldst not think how ill all's here about my heart, but it is no matter. So there's a kind of self-confidence and decisiveness appearing in Hamlet. And this is really an interesting moment. Not a whit. We defy augury, so prophecy, the idea that things can be, this kind of supernatural idea that the future can be foretold. And again, the use of the we there. Is that him and Horatio as scholars who are, you know, rational people who don't believe in superstitious things like prophecy? Or is it him assuming that, proving most royal with the language he's using, already speaking like a future king? There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come, it will not be later. If it be not to come, if it's not going to happen later, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. That death will happen later. The readiness is all, since no man of aught, of anything he leaves, knows. What is it to leave betimes, like at any time, at any moment? Let be. So there's an awful lot going on here. The idea about even the death of a sparrow has some special providence, has, you know, it's part of God's plan, comes from a verse, a chapter and verse linked to Matthew in the Bible. The readiness is all, like being, you know, a good death. It seems like a Roman idea, an historical idea. You know, I think of Marcus Aurelius, a famous Roman Stoic. Seneca as well can be considered a Stoic. The readiness and all, being prepared, dying a good death. And I think that's really interesting. Maybe the idea of the divine plan and the Stoicism, which we've seen earlier, there's nothing good or bad, but the thinking makes it so, seems to free him up to take the action he needs to take in the final stages of the play. And this is really interesting. Let be. To me, I would link that back to be or not to be. There he's deciding about life or death, his own or Claudius's, and now this indicates he chooses life. The irony being that in choosing life, in choosing to act and wield the sword and go and duel Laertes and deal with Claudius, he ends up dying. So there's a kind of bitter irony in choosing life. It still leads to death. Okay, we're going to come to this wonderful article on the British Library website by Kean and Ryan at Cambridge, Professor Emeritus, I believe. But we'll start off with thinking about some of the features of classical tragedy as they pertain to Hamlet. Do we have catharsis? This is the audience feeling pity and fear This is something I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to let you think about that. By the end, has that been achieved? When would the moment of peripeteia, which is the reversal of fortunes, happen? A lot of people put this at the mousetrap, which is kind of in the middle of the play, and the proof that Claudius did kill old Hamlet, and that triggers the kind of reversal of fortunes. It's like the pivot around which the play swings in terms of things going one way and then another. Like, Claudius's rise, and then Hamlet's rise pivot around that moment. And we've talked a lot already about Hamlet as a tragic hero. What might his Hamartia be, his fatal flaw, or his tragic flaw? Is it this procrastination, this overthinking, this ratiocination? Is it this melancholy that we've experienced? I have of late, but wherefore I know not. Act 2, Scene 2 meditation, where he explains to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern the kind of melancholy that wraps his heart. This image here is from Dürer, the German artist of the 16th century. I'll just get the date of this image for you. 1514. So the concept of melancholy is an early one. The modern idea might be depression, but it's much more complicated than that in the kind of Renaissance and Elizabethan understanding of it, to do with black bile and excessive black bile. But it was something in this image that is linked to death. We can see the skull in the geometric image here, to do with time, to do with art and knowledge. He's wielding compasses, which suggests that knowledge may be the magic square over here, which is to do with maths, maybe a source of black bile, of melancholic thoughts, of despair, or the dark thoughts, the kind of the dark clouds that hang around Hamlet. I'm trying to think, there's also Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. Let me just get the date up for you there. Robert Burton, Melancholy, 1577 to 1640. So when's the date of the Anatomy of Melancholy? 1621. But so although it postdates Hamlet, it is clearly something that the Elizabethan and Jacobean world were thinking about. The fact that there's a book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, and you can have a look at that if you want. Okay, what do we got here? The moment we haven't talked about really, Act 5, Scene 1, the gravedigger scene, which might prompt more of that melancholy in terms of as being the fatal flaw in Hamlet, is when he sees the skull. Might that be the skull of a lawyer, or it could be someone, a great buyer of land, and in this, the fine of his fines and the recovery of his recoveries, to have his fine pate full of fine dirt. This is again links to what we mentioned earlier about Stoicism, the idea that death is the great leveller, and that great or fine minds and skulls ultimately become dirt. So this idea of everything reduces to dust, which reminds me again of that meditation from Act 2, Scene 2. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me, nor woman neither. So the idea of man is merely a quintessence of dust, the reference there being to the fact that he's sculpted out of clay by God in the biblical sense. Here we get, in that same Act 5, Scene 1, a use of illusion. This is something, again, showing us Hamlet's scholasticity, his education in Wittenberg, where he makes references to Alexander the Great and to Caesar, not the first in the play. Alexander died, Alexander was buried, Alexander returneth to dust, the dust is earth, of earth we make loam. And why of that loam whereto he was converted might they not stop a beer barrel, i.e. act as a cork to plug a hole in a beer barrel? Imperious Caesar dead and turned to clay, might he not stop a hole to keep the wind away? So this idea of them becoming mere objects from the dust of their decomposed bodies, so the very great becoming the least thing, the greatest thing, Alexander the Great, Imperious Caesar, a reminder of how great he was, with that adjective imperious, being reduced to the least thing, a bung or cork for in that respect. Okay, let's anagnorisis. I mentioned this, didn't I? Here, let be. In deciding to live, to act and fight, he dies. This is like, there's a tragic irony to that, a bitter irony. Anagnorisis, tragic recognition of one's downfall. Where does this come in the play? When is the tragic recognition of his downfall? Is it in the closing lines of the play? Seems a bit too late to me. Is it the moment he realizes his actions have caused Ophelia to kill himself? This is again, I don't think there are any clear points, but this is good language to use. The Hamartia one's a lot easier to use, as we've seen. We can link that to character features. But anagnorisis, when does he have that moment of tragic recognition? I think that's less clear. Okay, we're going to get onto the bit at the top, but we'll start with this, and I'm going to do a bit of reading. So this is an amazing bit of literary criticism. It's very accessible, but it's very brilliant. Hamlet shows Shakespeare's intent on sabotaging the conventions of revenge tragedy. Kiernan Ryan explains why, the procrastinating prince. So do read that article. I'll link to it in the description, but this is where, this is the nub. This is where we get the pivot in Kiernan Ryan's argument from what most people think to what he thinks, and kind of this reimagining of how to interpret revenge tragedy in this play. What's wrong with all these attempts to account for Hamlet's delay, including Hamlet's own conjectures, is the same fundamental misconception. They all accept that the prince has a legitimate obligation to revenge his father's murder and thus restore the status quo. The fact that the murderer is the sovereign himself leaves him no option but to take the law into his own hands to achieve through revenge what Bacon called a kind of wild justice. That's Francis Bacon. So the tragedy of the situation is seen as Hamlet's unfortunate possession of some emotional, intellectual or psychological flaw, that's the hamartia, however virtuous its origin, which prevents him from fulfilling that obligation without delay. The assumption is that if Hamlet's character hadn't been marred by what he calls some vicious mole of nature and the stamp of one defect, that's from Act 1, Scene 4, the tragic catastrophe wouldn't have occurred, and the only corpse left at the end would have been Claudius's. Now this is Ryan's brilliant reimagining of that. But what if we proceed on the opposite assumption? What if Hamlet's tormented resistance to performing the role of revenger expresses a justified rejection of a whole way of life, whose corruption, injustice and humanity he now sees clearly and rightly finds intolerable? What if everything we see and hear in this play confirms Hamlet's conclusion that the world as it stands is a prison in which there are many confines, wards and dungeons, Denmark being one of the worst? In that case, the tragedy turns out to be something quite different. It's the tragedy of having to live, love and die on the soul-destroying terms of such a world at all, despite feeling the need and the potential to dwell in a world fit for what human beings could be, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. That's the same meditation I've been referring to. Instead of one fit only for the scoundrels, pawns and parasites, the quintessence of dust that societies like this force most of them to become. So the nub of his argument is, it's not Hamlet that's at fault, it's the time that's at fault, and it's almost impossible for Hamlet to act normally in an abnormal world. The time's out of joint, not Hamlet. do read that article. It is very good. So revenge versus justice. Is there any kind of satisfying revenge? Laertes kills Hamlet, but reconciles with Hamlet prior to dying, aware that he's used underhand means, the poison plot, to achieve his end, and regretful of it. Gertrude's dead. Claudius tries to stop it, fails to do so. This is a kind of excess death, unnecessary. So Claudius is ultimately responsible for that one. And Hamlet dies, but not before fulfilling the revenge of his father, but it cost his own life in doing it. So he kills Claudius, but he himself is killed in the process. But he does achieve the goal set out in Act 1, Scene 5 by the father of fulfilling revenge on behalf of the father. Is it satisfying? Is it a form of wild justice? For me, what's interesting is with those 4 corpses on the stage at the end, Gertrude, Laertes, Hamlet and Claudius, the court of Elsinore has come to an end, and we're left with a kind of tabula rasa. This is a Latin phrase which means clean slate. And maybe that's the only way somewhere as corrupted as Elsinore has become could be purged and set right. So the time that was out of joint has been set right through that complete catastrophe and purging of the rottenness, of the illness, of the malign tumour, in there. So we know that Denmark's a prison, that it's an unweeded garden, that it's a rotten state. But maybe through this mass death, we have a kind of purging and a fresh start, and it takes that death for that fresh start. Maybe Denmark has a future, the court is freed, the garden is weeded, the rottenness is purged, and we know that Hamlet's honour is restored through that process as well. But maybe it takes that fresh start and with Fortinbras, and that Hamlet would never have been able, or would have just reproduced the rottenness because of the time being out of joint and him being born in a time that was out of joint. So maybe that vicious circle would have continued, and what we get here is a clean break and a new, hopefully more virtuous circle with Fortinbras as the outsider, maybe able to operate in a way that wasn't possible even for Hamlet, even though he would have proved most royal. Maybe. Okay, there we are. Hopefully that's useful. I just thought I'd share those thoughts about the ending and what it means and how it can be interpreted, and give you some food for thought and get you to do some extra reading and thinking. Not sure when I'll be back in terms of videos, but hey ho, smash the like, do something nice to the subscribe, and I will be back when I have thought of something that I think is useful to say. Anon. Bye for now.